All right, well, it's 2 o'clock, so we're going to get started. So I'd like to welcome everyone here who's joining us today for this webinar. The Mocha team at Boris Effects, we all love to do these training programs, and I think we get something out of it as well as the users. So we're very excited to have you guys here. Today's topic, we're going to really focus on fixing things in post. Using both Mocha Pro's Remove module and also covering some of the tools that are found in Continuum plugins as well. So a very common question, if you've never attended one of these webinars, is will this be recorded? And yes, we are recording our program today. We typically get this up onto the website within 24 hours, but I will mention that you do have to stay to the end if you want to be considered for a door prize. Please use the chat panel if you have any questions. And we have some great, the chat panel, you can see we're showing this right now. Just ask any question. I'll be online doing a text chat, and Mary will be presenting live. And if there are times that, Mary's going too fast or you'd like me to jump in and kind of ask for clarity on a topic, feel free to mention that in the chat, and we'll try to sneak in and figure an appropriate time to interrupt Mary. As I mentioned, lots of great prizes coming. We're giving away a license of every product that we make, Continuum, Mocha Pro, and Sapphire, and one lucky winner will win all three. So what are we going to be covering? Also mentioned there's a discount code for all the rest of December. You can get 15% off anything in the Boris Effects store, including bundles. So that's a great time if you missed our Black Friday sale. The coupon code is WebDEC18. So today we're going to be talking about object removal for editors. And Mary, I don't know if you want to jump in now and we'll just kind of cover this together.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we're basically going to be showing how to use the remover tool, which is a BCC Continuum tool. And we're going to be showing how to use that for objects and beauty work. We're going to be showing how planar-driven masking is inside all the Boris Effects plugins right in the pixel chooser. So what I show you for the remover is actually applicable for any Continuum product that uses the pixel chooser. We'll be removing objects with Mocha Pro using the Remove module, and we'll be showing you how to use clean plates for faster fixes, talk a little bit about the remove settings so that you guys can get faster removes, because I know that's something that people get stuck on. And we're going to be covering at the very end a 360 nadir removal and talk about optimization for that. So, and I'm going to let Ross talk a little bit about the application manager.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyone who's getting our email blasts will know that we recently, just this week, launched something called the Boris Effects Application Manager. This is a free utility that you can download, and basically you can activate or deactivate your licenses right from here. This solves this has been in some of the other products for a while, but now it's also will work with Sapphire license. So this solves a really great issue that if you own a license, whether it's a permanent license or a subscription, and you want to move it from one computer to the other, it's this nice utility that you can use to just move your licenses around. So that's the Boris Effects Application Manager, and I recommend you check that out. It's highlighted on the homepage of Boris Effects. So
Yep.
at this point, let's turn it over to Mary, and she can jump into the basics of removal. And we're going to be focusing today in Premiere.
All right, so this is a removal for editors, right? We're trying to go over some easy, high-level concepts that can solve some of the problems that you guys run into all the time. So for those of you that don't recognize my voice, obviously I'm Mary Poplin. Ross introduced me. I do a lot of our tutorials online, and if you're not tired of hearing my voice, you can go ahead and jump over to boriseffects.com, where you can find a ton more of our tutorials. Now, we're going to be doing a couple of things. I'm going to show you how to do things like use the remover tool to patch and get rid of this yellow object over here that maybe we find distracting. We're going to go over how to remove things like the scar on the actor's cheek. We're going to talk a little bit about drone shadow removal. We're going to talk a little bit about reflection removal, because that's also a problem all of the time. And we're going to talk a little bit about what do you call it? Rover removal for 360. I was losing the word there for a second. So to jump in, we're going to start with this shot. This is a shot of a police officer. We find this little yellow block over here distracting. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the BCC remover to patch it with a piece of wall. And it's actually really, really easy. But the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about the concept of what the BCC remover does, and then we're going to jump into Mocha. This actually doesn't use the Mocha tracking or masking for this removal, and the reason it doesn't is because this is a still shot. So since it's a locked off shot, we can actually use the remover, and let's show you how right now. Let's turn both of these off, jump to our original scene, and let's go over here to our effects. What we're going to do is we're going to grab our effect. We're going to say remover, and I like to just type in what I'm looking for and have it find it for me. So BCC remover, we're going to drag this right onto our piece of footage. This technique works the same in whatever editing package you're in. So if you're in Avid, doesn't matter, works the same way. You go to your effects editor and you're going to go ahead and click on your BCC remover. One of the things I like about the BCC tools, or Continuum Tools as we call it now, is they have on-screen controls. So we have a source and we have a destination. So I'm going to take our destination and I'm going to move it over our little patch area here. And I'm going to take our source and move it over here so we can select a brick source, right? Now, I'm going to take a nice large area of brick. I'm going to go into my clone, and this works just like any other clone tool. We have a source and a destination. So it's just a copy from this section and paste in this section. But we can adjust our source. We can either adjust our source and destination location by hand, but in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to increase our radius, just like this. All right, now I'm going to take my feather for the edge of my radius, and I'm going to feather that out so it blends with the rest of my shot. Now I can take my destination, and I can just move it properly, and I can take my source and do the same thing. So I'll move the source until it looks right to me. So something like this. All right, that way our brick lines up. You see how I nudged that until the data lined up? That's just a manual fix that you have to do when you're using patches, but you basically have your source, you have your destination, and you have to find where your source is going to line up properly with your destination. It's a little bit manual. It's obviously not completely automatic, but you end up with a patch from here to here. That's how the BCC remover tool works. But this doesn't track. So you can't hook tracking data up to the source and destination. So that's kind of a problem if you want to do a removal on a shot like this. In this case, we're going to remove this guy's scar that's very noticeable on his cheek. And that's actually not really very hard to do, but I think a lot of users get stuck on this kind of thing. What you'd normally have to do is you'd have to take a roto shape, you'd have to draw a roto shape around the scar itself. If you were going to manually do this without a remover or without Mocha or without the BCC remover tool, you'd have to draw a shape around this, duplicate it over itself. So you'd have like track 1 and track 2, right? Track 2 would be where your mask was, and then you'd actually manually offset the object underneath your mask, and you'd have to make sure the mask tracked properly with this scar. And this is where the power of Mocha comes in. So what we can do is we can take our BCC remover tool and drag and drop it right again onto our timeline. But instead of using clone spot, I can use clone shape. And clone shape is really interesting because clone shape allows us to use Mocha inside of the pixel chooser. So we go down here to the pixel chooser Mocha. And like I said before, and I want to make sure I'm not going too fast, the pixel chooser in Mocha, it's like /Mocha. The pixel chooser is Boris Effects' keyer tool, right? So for those of you that have used the BCC tools before Mocha was introduced, the pixel chooser is not new for you. Basically, it's got a mask and a matte. You can actually use keying down here, you know, to pick the colors if you want, and it'll key out for you. But you don't necessarily want to use a key when you're trying to pull something like this. You get poor results, but you do want to use a mask. So we're going to hit Mocha Mask Track. And what that will do is that will launch Mocha. And Mocha will read directly off our timeline. Now, I want to point one thing out. We want to make sure that we're on full size when we do this. Unless you're in like 4K or 6K, in which case half size is okay. But if you're in 2K, you want to make sure that you're on full size because this reads directly from your timeline. It means that For those of you that are used to using Mocha in After Effects or the free version, before it was made into a plugin, it used to launch and it had to read your footage, and if your footage wasn't correct, it was a problem. This reads directly off your timeline. It bypasses all of that. So when we hit mask track, this reads our full frames off of our timeline. Now, I'm going to use our X-splines. X-splines, we have Beziers right here, and if you're used to using them, Beziers look like this, right? They've got handlebars, but if you want to adjust both handlebars at the same time, you end up with kind of a mess, okay? I like to use X-splines. The reason I like to use X-splines is they are faster, because I'm just going to draw a little shape right here around my scar, and I can relax for a curve, okay? Now, the reason I do that is because if I want to adjust all these handlebars, I just relax for a curve and they all relax at the same time, or they pull out and all expand at the same time. I also want you to notice that we have a transform tool that will allow us to transform all of these points individually or by selection. So when you're working in Mocha, this is a really good roto tool. Ross, did you have a question? Is that why you turned your mic on?
No, I just want to jump in and cover a couple quick things just to make sure that people are clearly understanding that you went into the Continuum Remover plugin, and just to be very clear, there's a light version of Mocha which is found inside of both Continuum and Sapphire now at this point.
Yes, exactly. Thank you for clarifying.
Yeah, because people always ask, well, oh, do I need a full license of Mocha to do what I'm doing? I own Continuum, but you actually don't. Everything you're showing is coming with the Continuum package, and that this particular effect, BCC Remover, is found in the image restoration folder in BCC. And one thing also just to mention, Mary, it might be good, maybe if you don't want to do it now, just in a second, just to show people the essentials mode, because I think for editors who are new to Mocha, sometimes they get overwhelmed with the interface. And this essentials mode interface came out this recently, and this is a very simple way to start working and learn Mocha.
You're right, and I'm just so used to Classic that it didn't even ping to me that I was not in Essentials mode.
No problem. I think it's just cool for people to see both ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing that I like about Essentials mode, if you're a new user, is that so I'm just going to switch between this and Classic for a second and point out some things. This can get real confusing for folks. We've got like, what does this mean? What am I tracking? When you go to Essentials mode, you're tracking translation, scale, rotation, skew, and perspective. You can see your track is right here. It's not down on the timeline, so the buttons aren't confusing to anyone. You know that your track is linked to itself. And if you want to see the surface tools, they're right here so that you can tell what your track is doing. Now, because we are actually using a simple little shape, we don't need to turn our surface tool on, because we're not actually doing like quote unquote tracking for this. We're just using a shape to follow an object. It is still tracking, but what I mean is we're not using a corner pin or a transform, so it doesn't really matter what the surface tool is doing. It only matters what the shape looks like for this purpose. If you're trying to track for a screen or to insert an object into the scene, then you need to turn the surface tool on to see what your track looks like, because that matters way more. One other thing I want to point out is we did add some new tools inside of this light version of Mocha. We have a magnetic tool that allows you to very quickly trace objects, just like this. And if you get to an object where there's no line to trace, you can just click down and it will draw a shape for you. And we also have some solids that make it really easy. So like if I just wanted to draw a circle around this, I could really quickly. But I actually want to make a complex shape around this scar. And the reason for that is because skin is actually complex and a circle is really obvious, but a shape like this actually reads as a more naturalized shape. So that's why I'm using that just as a pro tip. Okay. So we can name this if we want. We'll call this scar track. And we're going to go ahead and hit track backwards. We started from the middle. We could have started from any spot, but in Mocha, you want to make sure that you track from areas of the most detail to the least detail. So it's a little bit blurry here at the beginning of the shot because he's talking. So it's actually better to start tracking in the middle where he's not talking and where you can see the most texture. You want the texture that you're tracking, because Mocha is a planar tracker. What does that mean? That means we're tracking a texture. It means we're tracking a pattern of pixels as they move relative to one another through the scene. But what that really means is a texture that's moving in one direction. And in order for us to accurately track that, we have to compare one frame to the next. in order to compare one frame to the next, we need the best data possible. So you want the texture to be largest in frame, least blurry, okay, and most parallel to the camera, because that's going to give you the most detail. You're never going to have a perfect intersection of all of those things. Well, rarely are you, but this is actually a pretty good example of a perfect intersection. But rarely are you going to have a perfect intersection of those things. You just have to use your best judgment. Least blurry is always more important than larger in frame. All right, so we have our scar tracked, and it looks really good. It's hanging right on. I want to show you real quick something that you can do. Let's just go to classic mode for 1 second. If you ever want to see whether or not your roto is good, you can always use your stabilize. It's like an auto stabilize tool. It's activate quick stabilize. And if you scroll through, you can see that it's holding our shape in the middle of the screen, and we can see whether or not it sticks in our object really well. So I use that sometimes to check my roto. We're going to go back to essentials mode here. We're going to save, and we are going to close. Okay. Now, inside of Mocha, not inside of Mocha, inside of Premiere, I'm going to click my BCC remover tool. Okay. And you can see that we have this little offset tool right here. And I'm actually going to offset manually by just clicking and dragging until that shape is gone. So just like that. Now I can still see, if we look, I can still see a little bit of a line. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move down to my feather, and we're going to just feather this just a little bit, maybe at 15. And that will blend the edges of our shape back into our skin, okay? And now, if we scroll through this, Premiere will have updated this for me. And you can see that his scar is gone just like that using a very simple plugin. And because it's an offset, it renders really fast. Does anybody have any questions about the Continuum Remover tool?
No, I think that we're doing pretty well. I mean, I think it's a really great example because, I mean, this is the kind of work that editors have to do all the time, right? Whether they're in Avid or in Premiere or even in Resolve. And you can do this right in Continuum in the remover effect. And one thing I like to point out too is that the Continuum tools, they're cross-host, right? So that you could be an editor working in Premiere and starting this, some removal tasks. You could save your effect really, and then you could bring it into After Effects or into Nuke, not into Nuke with Continuum, but into another host like After Effects or Resolve, or even some of the other hosts that support OFX, and you can share this work. So that's a really neat kind of workflow.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very handy. I find it extremely helpful when I'm working.
We do have a good question that just came in from Michael Jackson, and I assume it's not the original Michael Jackson, but it's a pretty common name. He's asking, does the remover deal with light changes? And the answer is not really. You'd be doing manual light fixes. Within the remover, there's a very basic brightness, I think the control is, right, Mary? Or
yes.
It's some kind of luminance control. It's a very simple that you would keyframe and eyeball. But what Mary is going to show you for more advanced removes is that's when you might want to jump into Mocha Pro.
Yeah, I am going to show you real quick where that parameter is, though, just so you know.
Yeah, definitely.
So right here under clone, you can actually scale your remove. Okay, so if you have like an area of smaller detail that needs to go to an area of larger detail, you can actually scale your clone. And you can also scale the brightness right here. So you actually do have some control over your remover, so that's good to know. Let me just make sure you can see that. Let's make sure this is on. Perfect. Yeah, so here's our brightness. Obviously, we can change the brightness of that, just like this. Now, you can hand animate that over time, but what I suggest is if you have an area where shadows are coming in and out, just make sure that when you offset your clone, that you're offsetting it from an area that will always pull that shadow in correctly. So like if this guy had a shadow of blinds coming across his face at like a 15-degree angle, what you would want to do is you would want to make sure that that clone offset was on 15 degrees. I actually have a tutorial that's kind of like that. It's a UFO remove, and it's paint in Nuke. It's a way more complex paint, but the technique is the same. It's just a lot more complex. So you can find that on our website. Let's talk a little bit about the Mocha Pro Remove module, which is 100% different than the remover, okay? So when we talk about the BCC Remove module, okay, not BCC, the Mocha Pro Remove module, I'm going to confuse you, I'm sorry. The Mocha Pro Remove module is different than the BCC Remover, and the reason for that is because it's actually inside of Mocha Pro, and it actually replaces pixels from background information. It's not a clone offset. So let's jump into Mocha. I want to show you the before and after of this shot real quick. We're going to be taking this drone shadow out. It's a really common task, okay? And this is actually kind of a challenging shot. And the reason this is a challenging shot is actually because we're on a beach. And this seems like it would be really easy to track. But whenever you have a shot that's moving very quickly through the scene, like forward, and you have a very repetitive texture on the ground, Mocha is a planar tracker and it looks for similar texture. And sometimes this texture can look too similar. Mocha will jump to the next frame trying to make it fit, but will be incorrect. And we'll talk a little bit about how to counteract that as well. We're also going to talk about how to counteract moving forward into a scene. So here's our after, before, and after. We're just going to take that drone shadow right out, and you're going to be shocked at how easy this is. We're going to read all those pixels underneath and replace them. So I'm going to go ahead and take Mocha Pro, and we're going to drag it and drop it onto our timeline. And I'm going to launch Mocha, and we can do this actually from scratch in real time, no big deal. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take a shape and I'm going to draw it around our drone. And I'm actually going to go ahead and just use one of my solids. Blump. And we're just going to drag and drop this nice big fat shape right around our drone tool. And we're not going to track it. We're going to scroll to the end of our shot. And we're going to take our little circle and we're going to put it right around the center of that drone again. And because it's a drone and it's moving in a pretty smooth way, we can get away with that. There. Now we always have the drone right inside that circle. Very nice. All right. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this drone because I like to label. Actually, I'm just going to call it remove in big capital letters so you can see what I'm doing. Remove. We're going to remove this drone and I'm going to turn the gear off. The gear is the action item in Mocha. It means that we're actually tracking. So because we don't need to track this drone, we're going to turn the gear off on the drone. If we were in the remove module, it would mean we were rendering. But because we're in the track module, it means we're tracking. I just want to point out a couple of things about this. Clip, lens, track, adjust, track, and then exit modules. Everything in Mocha, that's a module, works from left to right. So clip tab is where you make sure your clip settings are correct. And that matters more for a standalone. It doesn't really matter as much for the plugin because the plugin reads off the timeline. All the clip stuff is handled for you. Lens. If you have a curve in your shot, and we do right here, we have a pretty severe lens curve in this shot, we could solve for this lens to get a better remove solve on our sand. Because it's sand, we actually pretty much get away with it. So we're not going to worry about it. And also because there's not any straight lines in this, well, there kind of are, but kind of aren't. Because there's not a lot of good straight lines in this shot, we wouldn't get a very good lens curve shot anyway. We wouldn't get a good solve because it's mostly organic instead of inorganic. But if you ever run into a shot where you do have a severe lens curve and you have a lot of straight lines, or if your DP miraculously shot a grid for you, you can use that to make the lens curve actually something Mocha reads before you do your track. You always want to make sure that that's done before your track because otherwise it'll offset based on what the lens curve is. Once you're done with your track, if you have any adjust tracks to do, you jump into that module. And once you're done with that, you can jump to the camera solve, the insert, the remove, stabilize, or the reorient. In this case, we're going to jump to the remove tab. So we're going to take our track and we're going to make a background track so that we can read underneath this remove because we're going to use background pixels to replace this foreground object. So let's go ahead and draw like a nice big shape right around our beach. But here's a problem. If I try to track this way, from the beginning to the end, okay, my track's going to slowly go off screen. And that's not going to be too good. We don't want our track to go off screen because eventually this track will go so far off screen that it'll end up with our surface behind the camera. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to jump to the end of our shot. The reason we jump to the end of our shot is because we want to track from the end to the beginning in a shot where we move forward. That way, the tracking data will always go into the screen. This matters just because of the way our tracker works. It does not like data that goes past the front plane of our shot. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to take our surface tool and we're going to align it to the ground. And now we're going to go ahead and we're going to move our background, excuse me, we'll just call this BG, underneath our remove. Now, the reason we do that is because we want the remove to hold out from the background when we track. So because of the layer order inside of the remove, we're going to keep the remove layer on top, the background layer on the bottom. That means Mocha will automatically hold it out from the layer beneath. Mocha automatically holds up all top layers from the layers underneath them. This is user defined. It is not Mocha's like automatic workflow. So if you rotoscope objects from the foreground to the background, so if you always roto what's in front of the next object, so the shadow is clearly on top of the sand, we want to make sure that that layer is on top. If you as the user, in a user-defined way, layer these layers from top to bottom, you will always have holdout mats for your tracks as you go through your shot. Going to be really important because I don't want the shadow to interrupt my planar track. We're going to go ahead and track perspective on our ground plane, and we're going to hit track backwards. Notice how we're only tracking about 20% of the minimum, tracking the minimum percent of pixels used is 20%, okay? That means we're only trying to match 20% of the pixels inside of this giant shape in order to move on to the next frame. That seems like it would be inaccurate, but because this shape is so gigantic, 20% is enough, okay? If we started to slip, what we could do is we could actually increase this number. Now, we have a problem. My shape is going off into the distance. That kind of stinks. That's going to very quickly make me run out of tracking data. So instead, we're going to say link to track none. All right, and now notice how that unlinks the track from my shape. So now I can use this shape and continue tracking. It will read all of the pixels that move in this spline without reading our little drone, and you can see the tracking data going off screen there. This is a really good illustration of the link between the track and the shape. The shape is only where the track is looking. This surface tool is telling you what the track is doing, and that's really important. So always make sure that your track looks good. Your shape doesn't matter. Well, I like to tell people that the shape can lie to them, okay? Because the shape is just where the track is looking. Now, I'm going to go ahead and let us sit through this track. If our track jumps or otherwise, slips off, what I can do is I can make sure that I grab more of this side texture in order to make this sit on my beach a little bit better, because like I said before, if we only track this section, let me just turn my mat off here for a second. If we only track this section of the beach, because we have such a repetitive little scattered shell pattern, Mocha would jump back and forth on this texture looking for the right amount of texture data. But because we include these random seaweed patterns and algae patterns, that will actually make our texture hold on a little bit better. And you can see it's not sliding or jumping as it moves off screen here way down the beach. And again, remember, we're tracking from the back to the front, not the front to the back, because you see how far off down the beach the surface tool has gotten? If we were tracking from the foreground to the background, that would come all the way off the screen. And I don't know if you guys have ever seen your shape like meat cake in on itself. I'll show you what that looks like here in a second. If you ever see your shape collapse in on itself, that's because the surface has gone behind the camera. You actually need to move your surface tool so that it's further inside the screen so that doesn't happen. All right, so I'll show you what that looks like. If you've ever seen your shape do, let's see, not that, this, okay? If you've ever seen your shape do that, that's the surface going behind the camera. So look out for that. Now, here's our remove tool, our remove shape, and here's our tracked background. Tracked background looks good to me. So we're going to take our surface, our little remove shape, and we're going to jump. We're going to turn our surface tool off. We're going to jump to our remove tab, and we're going to make sure we're selected on remove. We're going to say, hey, let's just see what it does with no adjustment to our settings. We're going to hit render for one frame. It renders it pretty quickly, okay? and we replace all of the pixels inside of the drone area with the pixels from around the drone based on our track. Great. But what happens if I hit auto step? We're going to render a lot faster. What happens if I hit auto step and then I say, instead of looking the entire frame range, let's look only 100 frames before and 100 frames after? Now we're rendering extremely quickly, okay? If we needed to add a lighting change, if we start to add linear, you can see it slows our render down just a little bit, okay? But if we need to add interpolate, it slows it down a little bit more. And these actually do different things. Linear is going to try to match the hue, saturation, and value around this spline inside of the spline with all of the pixels that it has replaced using these background pixels. Interpolate will actually look at shadows and lighting all around this shape, and it will try to fill in the data in between it in a sort of mesh warped color correction over the top, and that can make it a little bit slow. If you're using 2K images, linear interpolate isn't too bad. If you're using like 4K and 6K, this starts to be a major hit to your removes. Ross, did you have something you wanted to say?
No, I just add that some people have been asking if we can just be really clear on what are the new features. So like what Mary's showing right now in Mocha Pro 2019 is the remove module is running on the GPU. So you're going to get faster results, rendering results, depending on what video card you actually have in your system. I know Mary's running on like an Alienware laptop with some kind of NVIDIA sort of prosumer level, right? What do you have?
Yeah,
a Quadro?
It's a GeForce GTX 180.
Yeah, so if you have a beefier NVIDIA card, you'll definitely get much better performance here.
Yep, absolutely. And I just want to point that out. We literally render 200% faster than we used to render. So if I hit render backwards right now, we're getting about a frame per second.
And this is HD resolution running on your laptop, right?
Yep, exactly.
Yeah, and for me, one of the great things is that that linear illumination, and that getting back to that question that a user had about patching and matching the lighting changes.
Mm-hmm.
That linear illumination is a really, really powerful feature, and that is also accelerated.
Yes, it is. And also, I want you to notice, do you see how slow that was to start and how much it's sped up? It's because Mocha uses all of those frames that it rendered before to try to process these as it moves down the line. So it actually gets faster the more you render. The first couple of frames are slow, and then everything else is faster. But I also want to point out a couple of things you can do to make this blend. Do you see this edge? You can see a little edge here. And I want to get rid of that edge. Okay, like if you scroll really fast, it's a lot more noticeable, this little edge. So let's get rid of that. I'm going to do that in a couple of ways. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my shape and I'm going to use my Uber key, and we're going to actually add some edge width. So I'm going to use like a 15 pixel edge width and add a little feather to the edge of my shot. What that does is give me a little mask feather. I can even make it bigger if I like by adding a little bit more so you can see it a little better. See, we have a nice little gradient to our matte. So that will, make our edge a little bit softer when we blend this back in with the beach. And the next thing I can do is I can use interpolate, like Ross was saying, and interpolate will read the dark beach here and the light beach here. And even though it's a very subtle color change, okay, we actually need to account for it. So when I hit render backwards now, we have an absolutely seamless remove. So make sure it does render slower because we're doing a lot more calculations, but we get a much more beautiful invisible remove when we use those settings. Now, the reason I didn't use linear is because we're actually going to hit edges of this dark sand here where it's a little bit more wet. And if I use linear, that darkness will actually pull into the entire shape. And because the shape's so big, that's a poor choice. So instead, we're going to use interpolate, and it'll gradiate between that sand. Now, it's a subtle change, and you might think you could get away with it with linear, but in practice, you actually can't because that subtle change is really noticeable in motion. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does to me. There's a question here that might be a good segue to your next example while we let this render. And also, I just want to point out that, even though this is a regular, HD video shot, this same exact technique with a background layer that is tracked and then a foreground layer, in this case, it's the drone shadow. But that drone shadow could be a 360 rig, you know, in a 360 VR shot, it's really the same workflow.
Exactly, and we are going to touch on that at the end. One thing I do also want to point out is that we actually do not have to render in Mocha. We can render this whole thing in Mocha, and we can go to File, we can go to Export Rendered Clip, and we can export this right out of Mocha. But most people don't like to do that, so we're going to hit Save, and we're going to hit Close. Back inside of our Premiere, we're going to select our layer, select our Mocha plugin here, go to Module Renders, and we're actually going to render our remove right back to our timeline inside of Premiere. And Premiere will process this and remove this inside of our inside of our edit. Go ahead and finish what you were going to say, Ross.
Yeah, I have two questions that will probably lead to the next example. But one question just came in from Alexander is, how do you set up the frames before and the frames after in Mocha? You know, so if you go back into the remove module, and Mary will show you that when she selects her top layer, that there's you know, you're telling Mocha to analyze frames before and after to find the clean areas.
Yes. So let's go over these settings just a little bit. So input clip, you normally don't need to worry about that. The input clip is the input, so it's going to be your original plate, okay? Clean plate clip, this is what you need to worry about if you can't see behind your object and you need to insert a clean plate. We're going to talk about that in the next example, so stand by on that one. Your remove range, so we have your search range here, and this is how it's rebuilding all those pixels that replace, so all of these background pixels replace these pixels. So let's talk a little bit, focus on how this works. We look at all of the pixels in this shape to replace the pixels in this shape, but it's a timeline, like a linear timeline thing as well. So the first frame of our remove, in this case, is frame 0, and in this case is the last frame, which is 387, okay? We are looking at the number of frames before and after. We're looking at 100 and 100, and we can actually come in here and we can type a value if we like, or we can type 50, okay? And even make that faster, all right? We just need to make sure that however many frames we're using, we have enough data to reconstruct this. So, you know, obviously it can't be 2 frames before and after, or we wouldn't have enough data to replace the object. Now, auto step or step. Step of 1 is what it's set it to by default. And that means we're looking at every single frame, 50 frames before and 50 frames after, from the first frame to the last frame, okay? If I say auto step, which is also a new feature, the remove tool will try to find the best of both worlds, right? It'll say, I want to use, in order to save memory, I want to use the least amount of steps possible to replace this object, and it'll calculate it for you. Or you can come in here and say, I want you to look at every other frame by doing a step of 2, or every 5 frames by doing a step of 5. This can be a really good way to optimize your remove if you're having a hard time with render times. Illumination modeling is your lighting correction, so none, linear, and interpolate. We went over that. I actually don't recommend much using the smoothing level. It will try to randomize, but it's such an intense render hit that I don't feel like it gives you enough to be worth it most of the time. Blend interior, you almost don't need to worry about this most of the time, but if you get a line, you can ask it to randomize. Again, it is a huge processing hit, so use it very wisely. For most shots, it doesn't need it. 3D compensation will actually try to adjust if your planar surface you're trying to remove over has a little bit of a 3D offset to it, like the top of a forest. But again, it is an extreme rendering hit for, I don't feel like a lot of benefit, but sometimes it can give you better results if you have a very specific type of remove where you're removing over a plane that is bumpy, okay? Flood fill will actually try to fill any piece that it can't fill with a amalgamation of the colors all around it. There's very few things that works for, but stereo conversion is usually one of them. If you need to fill in a hole behind something and you don't think anyone's going to notice a blurry object over like a flat color behind it. And again, smoothing level, we'll try to smooth that flood fill, but again, it's a high hit on your calculations. So what I tell people mostly to focus on is the search range here, first frame, last frame, before and after, and step, and then your illumination modeling. These are the settings that you really need to focus on. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and yeah, it does, and that was a great explanation of all those tools. You know, I personally have found, like, you know, just setting the first thing I always check is I just do like 100 before and 100 after. Of course,
Yep.
it depends on how fast your object is moving, right? How many frames before or after the clean areas actually are. But that's like just a good general practice, maybe, is just do a quick test. And I think most people, to be successful with the remove modules, to do little quick render tests to get your best result before committing to your full final render.
Exactly. And you do that by hitting this render current frame button, not render forward and render backwards, because then what we're going to do is we're going to render a bunch of frames. All right.
Exactly.
So I'm going to close this and we're going to move on to, because I want to make sure we hit everything before we're out of time, because we got 20 minutes left.
As we're going to your next example, in fact, someone was asking about, when would you use a clean plate? So I think that's a great leading question.
I'm so glad you asked. Thank you. So when would you use the clean plate? You'd use a clean plate when removing, you can't see behind the object, or when you need to have something be held through an amount of time. So in this case, what we've got is we've got this guy walking across this window. Now, technically, I could do some roto across the guy and just remove him for the frames that he's walking across, but that could potentially be jarring in a reflection. So what we're going to do is we're going to take these people out of this reflection here so that we can focus on this girl and it's not distracting, because, that's the kind of things that you have to do as an editor all the time. Get rid of the distracting object, that's not conducive to telling your story. In this case, the guy in the white baseball cap moving through our reflection is not conducive to telling our story. In fact, he's distracting. So if we want to take him out, we can use a clean plate to basically replace this little section in the window for the entirety of the shot. And I'll show you how that looks when we're done. So here's our render. And let's talk about how to do that. Let's go ahead and take our original shot. We're going to take Mocha Pro, and we're going to drag and drop it right onto our timeline. We're going to launch Mocha Pro, again, making sure that we are on full frame. And this is actually a much more simple remove than you would think. We're essentially going to freeze frame this one section here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a nice shape right around this window. And we're going to call this BG. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to be a little bit clever about my foreground shape that I'm going to use for my remove. So watch, I'm going to actually draw inside the window frame, just like this. And we're actually going to pull tight at the corners so it's a nice square. And you see how I'm actually hiding the top of this square in the top of this bench? I mean, not bench, shelf. Sorry, I don't know why my words messed up, but there we are. We're going to hide the top of this square in the edges of the frame of our window and in the top of our little shelf here. And that means we're only going to replace this section of our window. We're going to call this remove. And we're going to actually link this to our background track. And the reason for that is I can't actually track this window without getting details from another section of the shot. And so what do I mean by that? Well, Mocha is a planar tracker. And a lot of times people don't think of reflections as occlusions, but that's 100% what reflections are. Like if you guys, and most of you probably do, have a cell phone on you, if you pick up your cell phone and you make sure the screen is off, you can use it almost like a mirror, and if you look, the reflection on your cell phone, if you hold it up and do it right now while I'm talking, you can see the reflection in your cell phone is not moving in the same way that your cell phone actually is. So that means that it's actually tracking planar data if you track that area that's across the room. So what we're going to do is we're going to link this to our window track because we're actually tracking the window instead of the reflection. So let's go ahead and hit track forward. I'm just going to actually leave it at shear because I don't really need perspective for this. And we're going to go ahead and hit track backwards. Just like that. Again, we're tracking from areas of the most detail to areas of the least detail. You want to make sure it's largest in frame, least blurry, and most parallel to the camera. And the reason I say most parallel to the camera is obviously as the camera turns away from you, you're going to lose that texture detail. as the texture has to combine. So we're going to let this track through. And the reason this is also tracking fairly quickly is because, again, we're holding out a whole bunch of pixels when we track, because we're holding out this reflection as we track. And we can turn our surface tool on to check our track and make sure it looks correct. And in general, I want you to get in the habit of turning your surface tool on to check your track, because, again, like I said, the shape will lie to you. All right, so once we're done with that tracking backwards, we can track forward, just like this. And so we are following the object as it moves through the scene. Once we have this background track, we're going to actually use a non-reflective, well, basically where we don't see the guy in the cap as a clean plate, because you don't have to think of like a clean plate as something you paint. You can also think of it as something, you know, from any other location in the shot. All right, so we're almost done tracking. And once we're done, I'll show you how to do that, how to make a clean plate. And clean plates, I just want you to think of essentially as a freeze frame. You can also paint them in Photoshop. So you can take a freeze frame and then paint out any object in Photoshop, and then you can actually bring it back in, and then Mocha will populate that throughout the shot as if you had painted it in motion. So let's go ahead and take our matte and turn it off and jump to our remove tool. Now, I'm going to turn my overlays off for a second, and let's scroll through and see where we can find a nice, let's see, where's a nice clean frame that I like? I like this one because it's largest. I can make sure that I have the most buffer zone around it. So I'm going to hit Create Clean Plate. And we're going to say Clean Plate Input 29. All right. And this saves a freeze frame of this at frame 29. And it helpfully puts it right here at the end of my file name, so that if I forget where it came from, I know it came from frame 29. If this ever says all, you want to make sure that that number says 29. Okay, so we're going to hit this checkbox here, and this is very important, that says use clean plates exclusively. That's because we don't want to replace his reflection with more pixels of his reflection. Okay, so now we're going to take our square defined here, not the surface tool, but the shape tool. And we're going to use the information that we got from our background track to replace this square using our clean plate exclusively. We're not going to use illumination modeling because we don't need to, because this lighting isn't changing, and I don't want to draw attention to it by having it flicker with any sort of lighting change at all. So now, if we turn our overlays off and hit render forwards, it's a lightning fast remove, and it takes our guy right out of our shot by using a clean plate that we made from one frame. And because we've hidden our edges at the edges of our window, it's completely invisible. And yeah, you can no longer see her arm moving in the reflection over here, but because you can see her reflection here and it's animating, and because these reflections over here are slowly animating with the rest of the camera, it's completely invisible, and you forget that it's even there. So does that make sense? Ross, does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, no, that's a great example. Definitely. I mean, again, like if you think of if you're an editor working in Premiere without this tool, you're going to have to basically, like Mary said, you have to basically create a freeze frame, stack that on top of your layer, and then really you can't really do match move tracking in Premiere, so then you probably have to take that into After Effects. So this is just a really a great way, and also a great example just for an editor to think of that clean plate as just like a frame buffer or a freeze frame. So very powerful way to remove objects.
Absolutely. All right, so we're going to save this.
Some people, yeah, you can, as you get into your next project, some people are asking about multiple clean plates, and I think that you might touch on that in your last final.
Yeah, absolutely. We will, in fact. But yeah, so again, because we don't want to render this and export it, you know, and import it back in, we can actually go to remove, render, and it will render back to our timeline as well, right inside of Premiere. So you can render right on your timeline. Just want to reinforce that. All right, so the last example I'm going to show here is removing a rig from a 360 piece of footage. And I actually have already baked this cake for you because we've only got 10 minutes left and you don't want to sit through tracking this for the 15 minutes it takes to track because it's 360 footage. So we're not going to start from scratch on this. We're going to start from a project that has already been tracked. But since you guys have already seen 2 examples of how to do this from scratch, I think it's fine. But I do want to talk about how to set up a Mocha Pro shot for 360. So a lot of you may have been used to Mocha VR. We dropped Mocha VR back into Mocha Pro, so now it's all one product. We're going to take Mocha Pro. You see how it says Legacy next to Mocha VR. We're going to take Mocha Pro and drop it onto our timeline. Under Views, Mono, Stereo, top and bottom, and left and right. So if this was stereo, top and bottom, we would select that. But because this is 360 and it's not stereo, we're going to select 360 Mono. So this is 360 footage. That is a mono view. And that's important to do before we even launch Mocha. So if you set this incorrectly and you launch Mocha, just go ahead and delete Mocha Pro and then reapply because it'll try to remember the settings and you don't want that. So let's go ahead and launch Mocha in 360 mono. And now it'll read my lovely equirectangular image, but now I have this 360 button over here in the corner. And I can pan around inside of my 360 space as if I were working directly inside of my footage. And this is an extremely handy workflow. So let's go to our nadir and let's draw a shape right around our object we want to remove. In this case, we want to remove our drone. Not drone, rover. Same thing, different word. Okay, now we're going to take our spline to define our rover, and we're going to draw it fairly widely around the rover. The reason I do that is because my rover is actually, okay, let me explain something. Usually people will try to do their remove of their rover like this. Don't do this, okay? The reason I say don't do this, and I'll zoom in so this becomes a little bit more apparent. If you look, you can see there's pulling right around the rover, and that's an artifact of the solve itself for the 360 footage stitch. Make sure when you are removing your rover that you remove these pulling problems right around the edge of your rover as well. Otherwise, you're going to repeat these pixels in your background track, and that's going to give you poor results. So make sure you don't do that. So we're going to call this remove. And we're going to draw a larger shape around it, but not much larger. And we're going to call this BG. We're going to drag this underneath our remove. Now, as I said, I actually already baked this cake for you, so we're going to close this and not save it. And we're going to jump to our Mocha Pro shot, where we have actually already tracked. We haven't tracked our rover because we don't need to, because you can see our rover is always within our shot. Very nice. Okay, but
yeah, we have. So really, just sorry to jump on top of you there, Mary. Really, just very similar to the way you set up the beach shot. You know, it's all about the layer order, right? So
yep,
putting the layer to track the ground and putting the layer above it for the rover that you're removing is really essential. And then that unlink, you know, someone was asking about that unlink technique, and that's a huge feature for 360 video because you really don't want to have to the shape chase the track.
Absolutely. So if you look here, you can see that we are tracking these pixels, and you can see our surface tool. Let's turn our grid tools on so we can really see. You can see that our track is moving, but the pixels we are not tracking are not, the shape that we're tracking is not moving because the shape is just where we're looking. We do that with link to track, none. That means that we have severed the parent-child relationship of this layer. So usually the track is the parent of the layer, and so the shape will move wherever the track is going. By setting link to track for the shape to none, we are unparenting the shape from the track, and instead reading all the pixels that move through this shape, okay, as a track that moves off screen while it doesn't. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. So we're going to use those same techniques in this remove to replace this rover, but I want to talk a little bit about how we can optimize our workflow. And I'll let Ross jump in here too, because this is one of his favorite workflows as well. But what we're going to do is, if I try to remove this, let's just look at my nadir here for a second. If I try to remove this rover based on these shapes, let me turn my grid and surface tool off so they're not in the way. You can see I select my rover shape, and we're using illumination modeling none. We're using frames before and after 100. We are not looking at 467 frames of 4K or 6K footage, for the entire frame range. That's crazy. And we are using auto step, okay? So we're going to hit render, just like this. And you see it takes a minute because we're doing VR footage. And even though we're using a GPU remove, it is taking much longer to render because we're actually doing a lens calculation. But this is still way faster.
I think anyone who's used the first iteration of Mocha VR will appreciate the speeds that we're getting with the new GPU removal.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. That is absolutely the case. Okay, so we've replaced our little rover here. Now, what we can do in order to speed up this remove is we can say, hey, create a clean plate for this frame. 385, save. Okay, and we can jump ahead to like 100 frames, and we can hit render. And again, it'll render again. And we can go ahead and say, create clean plate again.
And so this technique is a really valuable technique if you're trying to optimize your 360 removal process. We know that a lot of the 360 creators are not just working on a 100 frame VFX shot. They're literally using these tools for a very minutes long shot, and that can result in a very, very long render. So using some of these techniques to optimize your remove by generating clean plates is very, very valuable. There's actually a video I'll paste into the link here that Martin, our product manager, covers this as well.
Exactly. And I mean, I would say probably a more realistic frame jump is every 30 or 50 frames make a clean plate. Certainly 100 is a lot to try to make it work. Depending on how slow your rover is going and how much distance you have to cover, use your best judgment as to how many clean plates you need to use. But this is where you can start to really save your time. By only using a certain amount of clean plates, you will cut your render time dramatically down. Okay. And because we're saving our clean plate numbers, obviously it's populated it properly right here in our clean plate tab. And we can start to actually use our illumination modeling and use clean plates exclusively. We'll end up with a lot faster of a remove. So now when we hit render forwards, you can see that we're rendering much, much, much faster. Okay.
Right. It's basically going to be interpolating between the clean plates that you've just created rather than analyzing before and after in time. So this is a really, really great way to speed up these kind of removes.
Yeah, and it's extremely dramatic.
Someone was asking about, what if the rover goes over different textures? And actually, Mocha does quite a good job. As long as you have a good track for the text, you could be changing from this kind of cobblestone ground to some grass. And as long as we have a good track, we can actually, because we're actually using the actual footage from before or after in time. So it does a pretty amazing job at that.
Yeah, well, so to that I would say this is not a standard repetitive texture. Every single cobblestone is handmade, and it is moving, on a bumpy surface over time. I would say that if it can transition between this layer of cobblestones to this layer of cobblestones, it's not going to have a problem transitioning between grass. Just make sure that when you make your clean plates, that you make your clean plates close enough in the texture area to cover that section, so that you're not, so that you don't have bad data you're pulling from. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And just a couple questions are just coming up here. We're really getting to the end of the time. So, I definitely think that we could spend more time on some of the 360 removal for some of the advanced questions. But before you close this, do you mind just bringing up the clean plate dialog for a second?
Right here.
Yeah, and just to mention that, so these are the clean plates that Mary has generated, and you can beyond just creating them, you can delete them. You can also, open up these files and paint them on your own in a paint package like Photoshop or in After Effects Paint or anything like that.
Absolutely.
Um, the other point to make is these clean plates also work in stereo. So that's a very, very unique workflow if you're working in a stereoscopic 360 project. In fact, for the majority of the times, you don't even have to create a clean plate on both frames. Just having the clean plate on one frame will use the tracking from the stereo offset. So
You actually got me thinking about one technique for painting a clean plate. Let me just make sure that I can like if we're going to cover questions, I can show the lens workflow for painting real quick if you
mm,
want.
no, I think that we're right at the hour mark, and we've covered so much that I think at this point we should thank everyone for sticking with us, and we really hope you enjoyed this. It was a really great job, Mary. I think you covered quite a lot from the very basics of removing static objects for an editor in Premiere to all the way to this kind of more advanced example of removing a 360 rover, lots of really cool things that you showed in Mocha Pro 2019 and the new Continuum 2019. Also, just to reiterate that what we said talked about at the beginning of the webinar, we just launched the Boris Effects Application Manager, which is a free utility that any customer can download, and it's a great way to manage your licenses, install your licenses, and activate, deactivate your products without having to go to the website. So that's the Boris Effects Application Manager. So
Yep,
thanks a lot,
absolutely.
Mary. Let's bring Jesse on. Jesse, who's from our
Hello.
marketing team.
Hi, I just want to quickly announce all the winners of the raffles. Congratulations to Geraldo Seti, who has won the Boris Effects Bundle 1-year subscription. Congratulations to Anne Ronbeck, who has won the 1-year Mocha Pro subscription. Congratulations to Michael Yin, who has won the 1-year Continuum subscription. And finally, congratulations to Stacy Auckland, who has won the 1-year Sapphire subscription. You'll be receiving emails from me shortly.
Congratulations, guys.
Yeah,
I just want to
congratulations. Go ahead.
I just want to quickly mention again the discount code that's good through December 31st. If you can save 15% on any Boris Effects product, and the code is WEBDEC as in December 18.
All right,
Okay, thanks
perfect.
a lot for your time. Thank you, Mary. Great job.
All right, thank you,
Thanks,
Ross.
everyone.
Thank you, Jesse. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, folks.